Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into something that is, honestly, completely fascinating and maybe just a little bit unsettling. We're looking at Dan Weber's framework, which suggests that human reality itself is governed by a mental syntax. Now, we usually think of syntax and grammar as just those arbitrary rules you had to memorize in school to write a good essay, right? But what if those rules are actually the fundamental operating system of your brain? What if the exact same underlying logic that structures a sentence is the invisible scaffolding holding together everything you see, hear, and feel? We're going to unpack how the very structure of our physical perception perfectly mirrors the rules of language. To really get why this is such a game changer, think about this famous, entirely nonsensical sentence from linguist Noam Chomsky that Weber uses in his work. It goes like this: colorless green ideas sleep furiously. It instantly grabs your attention, doesn't it? Because, well, it feels fundamentally wrong to our brains. The crazy tension here is that, grammatically speaking, it follows the rules of English perfectly. Subject, verb, adverb, it's mathematically precise. But semantically, it's a total void. There's a massive, irreconcilable disconnect between those words. It's like this beautiful, flawless shell of syntax wrapped around absolutely nothing. And that deep, profound feeling of wrongness brings us to a really crucial leap in logic. Weber argues that the mental gap you feel between those mismatched words actually corresponds directly to a gap in physical space. Think about it like this. When you pick the wrong words in a sentence, you create a gap in meaning. Well, when you look out into the physical world, your brain is using a super similar mental syntax to judge depth, logic, and physical relationships. So if your brain encounters two physical objects that appear together but logically shouldn't, it mirrors that exact same grammatical failure. The literal grammar of your physical space is broken. They appear side by side, sure, but your mind intuitively screams that they absolutely do not belong together. So here is our roadmap for today. We're going to cover 1. The grammar of reality, 2. Spatial gaps in meaning, 3. Distorting the flow of time, 4. Binding the mind, and finally, 5. Neurosis versus psychosis. All right, let's jump straight into Section 1, the grammar of reality and the spatiotemporal continuum. Weber points out that while reality takes a ton of different forms, whether you're seeing it, hearing it, touching it, there's always this constant underlying tension between space and time. Normally, spatial and temporal relations play nice. They work seamlessly together to produce this coherent world that actually makes sense to us. But syntax isn't just for words. It's literally the invisible scaffolding holding all these physical perceptions together. And here's the trick. By intentionally distorting the relationship between space and time, we can expose that hidden grammar. We can actually see the gears turning in the human mind and reveal the hidden structures that dictate what we casually call reality. Which brings us to Section 2, spatial gaps and meaning, or what happens when things just do not belong together. Let's think about two total extremes. First, we have our old friend, colorless green ideas sleep furiously. This represents a complete failure of spatial integrity. The elements are entirely unrelated to one another, but they are forcefully crammed together in the exact same space. Now, consider the alternative. Dogs harmlessly young bark friendly. Let me just say that again because it's so weird. Dogs harmlessly young bark friendly. You can feel how jarring that is for your brain to process, right? The words actually are semantically connected. They all revolve around the concept of a young dog barking, but their order is entirely scrambled. Weber calls this a lack of temporal integrity. The concepts are perfectly fine, but their sequence in time is fundamentally broken. Let's pull this back into physical reality. To visualize spatial distortion, imagine a photograph where a really distant object appears to be held up by a near one. Picture a tiny man standing perfectly balanced on a young girl's outstretched hand. The objects are positioned super meticulously to create this cool optical illusion, but your internal logic instantly kicks in, doesn't it? You know tiny men don't exist. Just like a sentence forcing a noun and a verb together that don't belong, bad spatial perception pairs two objects that have no business being together. The gap in physical space between the real objects matches up perfectly with a gap in meaning. The overarching context has incorrectly bound to the object, and boom, the grammar of your reality is violated. Now for Section 3, distorting the flow of time and what happens when the order completely breaks down. If that tiny man optical illusion is an issue of broken space, what happens when we jump to the absolute opposite end of the continuum? That's temporal distortion. I want you to picture an incredibly eerie, kind of Picasso-esque portrait. The facial features make total sense individually. An eye is clearly an eye, a nose is a nose, but they are bizarrely, chaotically rearranged on the canvas. Why does that happen? Well, imagine the fragments were registered at slightly different moments while the face was in motion. This is the exact visual equivalent of that scrambled word order we just talked about. The elements belong together, absolutely, but because their strict order in time is distorted, the overarching meaning is just lost. The face becomes scrambled and incredibly difficult for your brain to read. Moving on to Section 4, Binding the Mind. How exactly does the brain coordinate this reality? You have to wonder, right? The brain is constantly managing this monumental task of interpreting massive amounts of spatial and temporal data. How on earth does it keep everything organized so we don't just see Picasso faces everywhere we look? Well, it relies on a neurological mechanism called phase-locked frequencies. To put this simply, think of a massive symphony orchestra. Different groups of brain cells are like the different musicians, and they're all playing their instruments at varying speeds and pitches. If they aren't perfectly synchronized, it just sounds like an awful, chaotic noise. Phase locking is essentially the conductors stepping up to the podium and perfectly synchronizing their timing. It coordinates all that spatial and temporal data, so we experience a beautiful, unified symphony, a coherent world, instead of a chaotic jumble of shapes and sounds. Weber frames this complex process brilliantly as context binding to objects. Imagine the context of a situation is a powerful wave in the ocean, and the specific object you're perceiving is a surfer riding that wave. The context literally carries the object forward in time and space. Now, when your mental syntax is perfect, when spatial and temporal integrity are fully aligned, the surfer glides effortlessly. It is an incredibly smooth ride. But if you introduce temporal distortion, it feels like that overarching context is completely failing to bind to the object. Suddenly, our surfer is thrown off the wave and is violently bumping along a jagged, irregular seabed. It's jarring, it's disconnected, and is fundamentally disorienting to your sense of reality. And that brings us to our final section, Section 5, Neurosis versus Psychosis, the psychiatric breakdown. Now we're going to impartially map this entire grammar of reality directly onto clinical psychiatry. If we equate spatial distortion with neuroses, we see a mind where contexts bind way too strongly to objects. Consider a neurotic individual who obsessively worries over a minor health symptom, entirely convinced it's catastrophic. Much like the illusion of the tiny man on the hand, the illusion is flawless and incredibly compelling precisely because the context has overbound itself to the object. On the flip side, if we equate temporal distortion with psychosis, the context utterly fails to bind. Imagine a mind trying to piece together a reality that is constantly fracturing in time. The person is left with an incredibly confusing and terrifying experience, exactly like trying to read the emotions on a face where all the features are scrambled. This actually leads us to a truly revolutionary perspective on mental health. What modern psychiatry has long considered a strict, absolute dichotomy, a hard line drawn between psychosis on one side and neurosis on the other, might actually be something entirely different. According to Weber's framework, these aren't two disconnected conditions. It might simply be the human mind struggling at polar opposite ends of the exact same spatiotemporal continuum. It's all the same underlying system. It is simply your mental syntax, the literal grammar of your reality, breaking down in two distinct polar opposite ways. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a thought to genuinely challenge your own perception of the world around you. We've seen how a gap in physical space perfectly mirrors a gap in the meaning of a sentence. We've seen how distorted time acts exactly like scrambled, incoherent words. Syntax clearly isn't just a subject for grammar enthusiasts anymore. It appears to be the fundamental, invisible fabric of human perception. So if bad grammar truly mirrors bad perception, and severe mental illness is simply a breakdown of spatial and temporal coordination, is your entire reality, everything you experience, just a matter of maintaining good syntax?